Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, a program that today is going to talk about a book with the longest subtitle I've ever heard of. The first part of it's pretty short. It's called Killing the Messenger. And the subtitle is A Story of a Radical Faith, Racism's Backlash, and the Assassination of a Journalist. The author, Thomas Peele, has come by, and I'm really glad to see you.
Thank you for having me.
And then the publisher, which we must never forget, is Crown. And it is the longest subtitle I've ever dealt with.
You know,
it seems to me, my guess is there was a committee meeting and a compromise was reached.
The subtitle was a struggle. The subtitle went through a couple of drafts, and there were, some back and forths, and this is kind of what came out of that process.
Looks like each person at the meeting got one phrase.
And we threw some commas in just to, make it grammatically correct.
It's a terribly important story because the assassination of the journalist, this is a story that occurs in Oakland for the most part, and the journalist is Chauncey Bailey, and everybody out there is going to say, oh, I know that story. And the one thing that's going to happen with this book is they're going to learn that they don't know the story. And they're going to understand that you have provided us all with a fantastic service.
Thank you very much.
At the start, I want to note that and thank you for it.
Thank you.
Now, in your little biographical note here, they call you something I've never heard anybody called before, and I want an explanation. It says you're a digital investigative reporter. Is that bad?
No, it means that I work for the online department of the Bay Area News Group, which is part of a company called Digital First Media, and we are attempting new ways to deliver traditional journalism in a digital format.
Great. You're also a lecturer, is it, at UCal Berkeley's Journalism School?
Yep. I teach a class in public records reporting.
Okay, and you've won some honors, including the Investigative Reporters and Editors Tom Renner Award for reporting on organized crime and the McGill Medal for journalistic courage. What did you do?
Reported for almost 5 years on Mr. Bailey's murder and the people involved with it.
It was a tough one.
That it was.
It was a tough one. One of the things that you're involved with also, besides the ones that we've mentioned, is something called the Chauncey Bailey Project. What's that?
That is a collaboration of print and broadcast and online journalists, people from nonprofit journalism organizations, and a couple of universities and some university students. And after Mr. Bailey was killed, we got in a room and hashed out how we would make a collaborative response to his murder. And it was modeled largely on something called the Arizona Project, which occurred in 1976 when a reporter in Phoenix named Don Bowles was car bombed to death. And journalists from around the country descended on Phoenix to finish his work. And the short, pithy message is you can't kill a story by killing a journalist. You kill a reporter, and 20 reporters are going to show up and further what that reporter was working on. And that's effectively what we tried to do with what Mr. Bailey was working on.
How many reporters are involved or were involved?
It was a fluctuating number, and not everybody involved was a reporter. We had some nonprofit administrators who helped us raise money. We had some wonderful people who built websites for us. At the core of it, there were 5 or 6 reporters.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, really, it was 3 of us, 4 of us, really spent a long time digging into what happened to Mr. Bailey.
In this book, Killing the Messenger, you tell what I would call a highly detailed, complex story. For example, you take us back to slavery, to the Civil War, and the post-Civil War migration, all giving us a fantastic historical, detailed background of race relations in this in this country. But you also, as a reporter, give a very, as it were, brief kind of essential story. On August the 2nd, 2007, Chauncey Bailey was shot to death brutally in broad daylight. When and where?
Oakland, 14th and Alice Street, 7:24 a.m., August 2nd, 2007.
I remember reading that, I guess it was last night when I got to that part of the book, and you give us a page and a half of somewhat brutal details. The killer, a fellow by the name of Broussard, whose first name I have no...
Devondre.
Okay. Where's that spelling come from? Is that Creole?
I think so. I wasn't able to get too deeply into his family history because it's very, very fragmented, but I believe that there is some Creole ancestry.
There's something very chilling, I mean, beyond the killing itself, but it seems to me there was something very chilling in the fact that Broussard felt that he had to go back and make sure that he shot 3 times.
Those were his orders. And Broussard would later say he was just trying to be a good soldier when he gave a rather flawed confession about what happened. But he was told, get in close, shoot 3 times, make sure the blankety-blank reporter was dead. And he had a 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun loaded with buckshot and slugs. Mr. Bailey was dead in the first 2 shots, but Broussard wanted to stay true to his order, went back, and as Mr. Bailey lay on the ground, dead or dying, seconds after the first 2 shots, he fired a load of buckshot directly into his face.
Yeah, he had run to his car or to the getaway vehicle.
And then turned and went back.
He
remembered his orders.
Yeah. To me, that was very, very chilling. Very, very chilling. This sort of story could not have happened without a strong political component. And I want to look at that when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Killing the Messenger, a story of radical faith, racism's backlash, and the assassination of a journalist. That's the book we're talking about. And of course, we're talking to Thomas Peele, who has written the book, and it's a marvelous one. A.C. Thompson, investigative reporter himself for ProPublica and PBS Frontline, says in part about this book, Thomas Peele is one of the great investigative reporters working today. His remarkable and obsessively researched book, and it does seem obsessive at times, charts the trajectory of an Oakland crime family responsible for a string of murders. What a string. More important, perhaps, it exposes the willful myopia of the city officials and community leaders who allowed this outfit to operate over a span of decades. I want to get into some of the things they did and the willful myopia that Thompson talks about. But first, I think we need to learn a little bit more about Chauncey Bailey, whom you identify in a very honest way. At the time of this story, a journalist probably on the downside of his career. What kind of a career did he have?
Chauncey Bailey was a 57-year-old man who had worked his entire life for newspapers and had sometimes dabbled in broadcast. He began at the San Francisco Sun-Reporter, an African-American oriented weekly in the early 70s. Mm-hmm. He got out of there and went to Columbia to a summer program for minority journalists and ended up at the Hartford Courant in Connecticut. He went to UPI for a while in Chicago. He spent 1 year as a congressional press secretary, and then he landed at the Detroit News, where he stayed for more than 10 years covering City Hall and African-American affairs. And he was one of those reporters that was highly productive. He wrote a heck of a lot of stories. An editor told me that his strength was the ability to get it down and get it in. You wanted 12 inches on deadline. You wanted Chauncey Bailey to write it. It wasn't going to be fancy. It wasn't going to be a lot of prose. It was going to be facts. It was going to be a hard news story. He was good at that. He was good at helping fill up the newspaper, which lay people may not know is sometimes is a challenge to an editor to get good stories in the paper, in the Metro section, on the inside pages, and cover things. You know, he covered Coleman Young as the mayor of Detroit. He left for the Detroit News and returned to California. He worked for a year in the mid-'90s as the news director of a radio station, and then he went to the Oakland Tribune and basically did the same kind of reporting there that he did at the Detroit News. You know, he covered the African American community. He wasn't a superstar. He was a community reporter, and there's been some lionization of him since his assassination 4.5 years ago, that he was a great investigative reporter. That wasn't who he was. He was the guy, especially when he ended up a little while later at the Oakland Post, the paper he was working for at the time he was killed, who would show up at a kids' track meet at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning with a camera because he wanted to get some smiling kids in the newspaper because he knew that there was value in that. He was a very good community journalist.
And as a journalist, the kind of guy that you'd like to have around you. I mean, you'd like to be working next to him because you could rely on him. He'd do an honest job.
He knew everybody. He knew more than he could ever get in print about people and issues in the community. You know, that said, we have to be fair to the facts. He was fired from the Oakland Tribune eventually for some ethical problems. But despite that, he wanted to stay in newspapers, and in June of 2007, he was named editor of the Oakland Post, which is a small African-American weekly.
Moving over now to your Black Muslim bakery. It can be described as something founded by Joseph Stevens, who later took the name Yusuf Ali Bey. Your Black Muslim bakery was a podium from which Bey practiced his fictive form of Black Islam that included a belief in white devils and spaceships. Bey preached fundamental Black Muslim beliefs that others had long dismissed, while behind the scenes, and this is what we're interested in here, he led a violent, polygamous cult where women and girls were kept as little more than sex slaves. Bey, who once ran for mayor of Oakland, operated seemingly unchecked by local police and politicians. I guess the big question is, why is that true, that he ran this nasty business of his unchecked?
When he ran for the mayor of Oakland in 1994, he garnered 5% of the vote in a 11-person field for a runoff to challenge the sitting mayor, Elihu Harris. And it was perceived after that he had a constituency. Of course, he ran at the time with incredible hubris in that he was raping within his flock with impunity. And this is a man who fathered upwards of 50 children. And he was very good at creating an image that he was a very hard-nosed reformer, that he was anti-drug, that he was pro-work, and after he ran for mayor, he was able to cash in on this idea that he was a community leader, that 5% of the vote in a tight race could mean something, that he spoke for very disaffected people in the ghetto.
And he was also seen as a guy, or as the bakery was seen as a place that would take homeless people off the streets, feed them and clothe them and give them a job. It turned out to be like slave labor, but people were looking the other way by that time.
Especially with some young girls who I write about a lot in the book. A woman who was one of his concubines ended up as their legal guardian, and she simply turned them over to him as sex slaves. They testified in a lawsuit that they worked for years in his bakery without getting paid.
Killing the Messenger tells a story with many ironic twists and turns. And when we come back, I want to look at perhaps the most ironic.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
That's me. I'm talking today to Thomas Peele, the author of Killing the Messenger, the story of radical faith, racism's backlash, and the assassination of a journalist. Publisher is Crown, and a pretty fair country writer by the name of Robert Lipsyte has said in part, tough, taut, and true. Killing the Messenger is a nonfiction noir trip through the dark side of religion, journalism, racial politics, and law enforcement. Then he concludes a real thriller. And it is all of that. It really is all of that. It's a remarkable book, and it's wonderfully written. And to prove that, I wonder if you could read a little bit from the book, please.
Sure. This is the conclusion of a chapter that kind of outlines or talks about Yusuf Bey's abuses within his cult. It had been 2 decades since the man who had people killed had returned to Oakland from Santa Barbara. Yusuf Bey had achieved the power and wealth of which he dreamed. His involvement with the Death Angels years earlier remained a buried secret. His bakery had made him millions, much of it thanks to ruthlessness and illegality. He'd committed systematic public assistance fraud. He commanded an army of loyalists ready to commit violence at his command. He went on television every week in an endless screed about devils and slave masters. He had dozens of young children who bore his name, sons in ascent. He beat and abused women with impunity. But from the outside, his separatist black Muslim ministry appeared to be a thriving success. Even Christian ministers joined local politicians in paying Bey a grudging respect of getting people off the streets and seeming to turn their lives around. Unlike Elijah Muhammad, Bey had managed thus far to conceal his true nature from the outside world. As he reached middle age, it seemed as if there was little he couldn't accomplish.
And it seemed like nobody would touch him, that nobody would ever come forward and say this guy is what he is.
People lived in great fear of him. One of the things that's in the book is the fact that he was, in 1986, raping a boy in the bathroom of his bakery when one of his workers walked in and witnessed this and told people what he saw. And the poor guy didn't have sense enough to run for his life. And he was found shot dead 2 days later. This is someone who would kill to protect himself and to keep his secrets. And everyone who came under his spell eventually learned that and lived in deep fear of him.
Eventually, a woman named Nancy does go to the police and starts to report the way he's been treating women and young girls. And you're right, when this woman starts telling the story to the Oakland Police Department, it was as if the building shook. And no one there wanted the case. Yusuf Bey, child rape, he'd run for mayor. He had deep political connections. Senator Parata had gotten him contracts. The city loaned him money. The cops' unofficial rules of non-engagement with the Beys were well in place. So that's the kind of situation that we're dealing with here. I mean, the guy was literally untouchable.
The guy had an old political phrase, juice. He took that run for mayor and he capitalized on it. He got $1 million small business loan from the city, and they systematically defrauded with the money. He really thought he was untouchable, and it took this woman, the pseudonym in the book for her is Nancy, to realize that the daughter that she had born to him had also become one of his victims. And when that happened, she mustered her courage and she went to the cops, and that was enough. And what follows, and part of what you read, though, is something that illustrates just how deeply entrenched his power was. He was the member of a civic group called Black Men First, and they were doing good work. They were going out in the ghetto and trying to stop murders, which were rampant in Oakland.
Mm-hmm.
And when he showed up for the next meeting after his arrest, rather than move away from him, to look at him as the pariah that he was, he got a standing ovation from the ministers and civic leaders in the room when he entered, as if to say, the police department is so untrustworthy that we will give you all the benefit of the doubt, sir, even when you were accused through scientific evidence of horrible crimes.
Of all the amazing things in this book, that scene's got to be one of the most amazing. Equally amazing is the ultimate irony that I want you to talk about. Somehow the police got their act together and they scheduled a SWAT attack on the bakery for August the 1st, 2007. What happened?
They were responding to 2 murders. By then, Yusuf Bey IV, who was eventually convicted of ordering Mr. Bailey killed, was in charge. He'd had 2 other people killed, and the police had finally begun to move, and they were set to go on the bakery, execute search warrants on August 1st. The police chief, though, he blinked because 2 senior SWAT commanders were out of town on a vacation. He said to delay the raid for 48 hours. It's been 30 years. What's another 2 days? It was in that 2-day period that Chauncey Bailey was walking to work and was gunned down because Bay 4th had learned he was going to soon be reporting on the bakery.
This is a book that you have to read. You have to understand what's going on in the world around you, how dark it can be, how unjust, and how much courage it takes a writer like Thomas Peele to bring you the story in a book called Killing the Messenger, a story of radical faith, racism, backlash, and the assassination of a journalist. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.